Putin loved to call Venezuela a friend. He repeated it in speeches. His officials repeated it in interviews. Russian TV repeated it like a prayer. And then Moscow did something even louder than words. It put real money, real weapons, and real political risk into that friendship. But this was never charity. And it was never romance between two distant nations. Venezuela was a chess piece. A way for the Kremlin to say to Washington, I can show up in your backyard too. A way to build sanctions, workarounds, trade influence for oil and keep the illusion of global reach alive. And now the bill has finally arrived. I'm Elvira Bary, a writer born in the Soviet Union. Today, we'll look at what Putin actually wanted from his special relationship with Maduro. What deals were on the table and why this whole gamble is now boomeranging back at Moscow. Here's our roadmap. What Putin wanted. Why the Kremlin got so deeply involved with Venezuela. The oil money. How Russia tapped into Venezuela's oil reserves but backed off. The arms trade. How the weapons trade tied the two countries together. The backdoor. How Maduro's regime helped Russia evade sanctions. The Narco Shadow. How Venezuela's ill-famous drug trade landed a blow to the partnership. What Putin lost. How Maduro's fall is likely to backfire on Russia. If independent analysis matters to you, subscribe, like, share, or join my think tank. Or support via PayPal or Super Thanks. You can also give this video free high points so more people will see it. Now, let's start with the simplest question. Why did Putin care about Venezuela at all? What Putin wanted? In Latin America, Venezuela was the nation that was the easiest to turn against the US. Its government was isolated, angry at Washington, and short on cash. When Putin signed papers with Nicolas Maduro, he was essentially talking to Washington saying, I can show up in your neighborhood too. That's why these visits always came with the same props. Flags, handshakes, big words like strategic partnership and promises about energy and sovereignty. In May 2025, Putin and Maduro signed a strategic partnership agreement in Moscow. On paper, it was about energy cooperation and joint work inside clubs like OPEC Plus and the Gas Exporting Countries Forum. It also spelled out cooperation at the United Nations and a shared line against sanctions. Now, look at the second motive. Standing not alone. A sanctioned leader doesn't only need money. He needs other leaders willing to stand next to him to pose for photos and smile, so his own elites don't panic. Maduro needed that even more. When you are running an economy that keeps shrinking, every foreign handshake becomes a domestic TV show. We still have friends. We still have patrons. That was how the two regimes propped up each other. In December 2018, Venezuela welcomed two Russian Tu-160 strategic bombers. It was a joint exercise, a short visit, a big show, and a loud message. The third motive was leveraged over the future. When a country is desperate, like Venezuela was for decades, it sells away tomorrow to pay for today. Russia used that to plant itself inside Venezuela's state machine as a last resort creditor. Since 2006, the Russian state and Rosneft lent Caracas at least $17 billion in loans and credit lines. And when the Venezuelan crisis turned into a direct standoff with Washington, Russia did more than express verbal support. In March 2019, two Russian military planes landed near Caracas with nearly 100 troops reported on board. Russian officials called them specialists. US officials talked about cybersecurity and support roles. Whatever the exact job titles were, The message was obvious. The Kremlin was willing to help Maduro hold power, and it had multiple reasons to spare no expense in doing that. The oil money. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves on paper, but paper doesn't pump barrels. Pumps need parts. Parts need dollars. Under sanctions, dollars become the rarest thing in the country. So Russia came in as a creditor and a trader, much like a pawn shop that gives you money to live a day and takes your best jewelry as collateral. A clean example is CITGO. In late 2016, Venezuela's state oil company pledged 49.9% of shares in its U.S. refining subsidiary, Citgo, as collateral in a financing deal. Reporting at the time tied that pledge to a loan from Rosneft. Then, sanctions turned this business model into a minefield. For years, Venezuelan oil had one destination, the U.S. Gulf Coast, because the refineries there were built to handle heavy crude. After U.S. sanctions tightened in 2019, that pipeline collapsed, and the center of gravity moved to China, not always in a straight line. Cargoes were rerouted through intermediaries and ship-to-ship transfers, then rebranded on paper as Malaysian or Brazilian blends before ending up at Chinese refineries. In total, Venezuela sold between 100 and 170 million barrels per year to China. In the middle sat Russia as a service provider. Rosneft Trading and TNK lifted more than a third of Venezuela's exports in 2019. And China was the big creditor behind the curtain. Loan for oil deals, starting in 2007, meant part of the crude flow was not just sales, but debt repayment. So the triangle worked like this. Venezuela produced and begged for cash. China provided credit and took barrels. Russia helped move barrels and kept the whole thing running until it became too risky and too expensive. In February 2020, the U.S. Treasury's Sanctions Office designated Rosneft Trading SA for operating in Venezuela's oil sector. In March 2020, it designated TNK Trading International SA for the same reason. Those designations mattered because production and shipping became really complicated when a country can't sell openly. Hit the traders, and you choke the pipeline. That same month, Rosneft announced it was selling its Venezuelan assets and terminating operations there, saying the buyer was a company fully owned by the Russian state. In the same announcement, Rosneft said it would receive a 9.6% stake in its own share capital in exchange. That tells you two things at once. The Kremlin wanted to keep the Venezuela exposure inside a state structure where it's easier to absorb sanctions risk. And Rosneft wanted out of the blast radius. And yet the story didn't end. In November 2025, Venezuela's National Assembly approved a 15-year extension for joint ventures linked to Roszarubezhneft, a Russian state vehicle created in 2020 that took over Rosneft's Venezuela assets. Lawmakers spoke about targets through 2041, including planned production from specific Western fields and hundreds of millions in investment. So even after the exit, Russia stayed, just under a different legal hat. Putin's bet was that Venezuelan oil, even half broken, could still be turned into repayment and influence. But the more broken Venezuela became, the more Russia had to do the unglamorous work. Find routes, find intermediaries, accept barter-style arrangements, and constantly redesign paperwork to survive sanctions pressure. So that was Putin's first loss in Venezuela. He lost the fantasy that the country's ample oil reserves could turn into easy money. What he gained was exposure risk and a long chain of obligations that only pays off if the partner state can still function. The arms trade. Putin's next motive in Venezuela was to lock a friendly regime in place with weapons supplies. Oil deals can be renegotiated. Political promises can be forgotten, but an air defense system that needs spare parts is like a color. Once you buy it, you keep coming back. That's why the Kremlin loved arms exports to Caracas. Venezuela was a lucrative long-term service contract. Back in September 2009, Russia lent Venezuela more than $2 billion so it could buy Russian weapons. Chavez talked about 92 tanks and an S-300 air defense system as part of those purchases. It was a loan that created dependence and also a message to the US. We can raise the military stakes. By May 2017, Venezuela already had 5,000 Russian-made manpads, portable air defense systems. This number meant a huge pipeline of storage, training, and control systems that could rot without constant attention. The initial sale was only the first bite. Maintenance was the Kremlin's real meal. In March 2019, when Maduro was under pressure at home and abroad, Russian officials openly described their presence in Venezuela as military technical cooperation. The Guardian reported that Russian military officials arrived to discuss training, maintenance, and strategy. There's also a quieter part of the weapons story: small arms and ammunition. In July 2025, Venezuela opened a Kalashnikov ammunition factory in Maracay, producing rounds for Russian AK-103 rifles, with capacity reported up to 70 million cartridges a year. This project shifted Venezuela's dependence from finished rifles to a local stream of ammunition, with Russian tech expertise still required to keep the factory running. The back door. When sanctions bite, a bureaucracy doesn't stop selling oil. It builds workarounds. That's what Russia did after 2022, building its shadow fleet of oil tankers. I have a dedicated video about this operation, and Venezuela was part of it as well. Russia learned many evasion tactics from Venezuela, like ship-to-ship oil transfers and dark voyages with location tracking turned off. Back in 2020, Russia helped Venezuela bypass sanctions via Rosneft-linked traders that were later sanctioned by OFAC. After the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia and Venezuela started using the same oil tankers under third country flags to move their oil around discreetly. Since July 2025, Venezuela started importing Russian oil to dilute its heavy crude. One such shipment was about 300,000 barrels on a sanctioned tanker entering Venezuelan waters in December 2025. That same month, the US announced fresh Venezuela-related sanctions targeting traders and tankers tied to sanctions evasion. The Treasury also called out vessels it said were part of the Russian Shadow fleet. Typically older ships with opaque ownership and weak insurance. Around that time, the US Coast Guard seized a sanctioned supertanker carrying Venezuelan crude, and US officials attempted to intercept other vessels linked to Venezuela. Caracas responded the way weak states often respond, by trying to criminalize the blockade. Venezuela passed a law against piracy and blockades in the middle of those ship seizures, and the physical bottleneck was brutal. If exports stall, storage fails and production has to shut. On December 31st, Residential fuel was topping off Venezuela's storage tanks as exports were cut to a minimum and tankers were used as floating storage. Now bring Russia back into the frame. For Moscow, Venezuela was useful for Moscow partly because it was a lab. It showed how a sanctioned state reliant on oil exports survives, how it pays, how it ships, how it hides, and how it trades discounts for oxygen. But the lab can become evidence. Once routes are mapped, they get burned. Once the ships are named, they get seized or sanctioned. Once the intermediaries are exposed, they demand higher fees or disappear. Venezuela was part of Putin's logistics network under constant fire. So that's another thing he lost in Venezuela. Time-proven routes and ships that kept Russian oil revenues flowing. The Narco Shadow. Although Venezuela is amazingly rich in oil, it's sadly known for a different kind of exports: illegal drugs. Over 200 metric tons of cocaine are estimated to make their way through Venezuela each year to sell in the countries farther to the north, mostly in the US. In March 2020, the US Justice Department announced charges against Nicolas Maduro and other current and former Venezuelan officials. The core allegation was a partnership with the FARC, including cocaine trafficking and violence. Fast forward to June 2025. Hugo El Polo Carvajal, the former head of Venezuelan military intelligence, pleaded guilty in Manhattan to narco-terrorism and drug trafficking conspiracies. Prosecutors said he helped lead a cartel of Venezuelan officials working with the FARC to move cocaine toward the United States. This is the human scale part people skip. Carvajal wasn't a street dealer. He was the kind of man who sits in the same rooms as presidents, signs papers, and orders arrests. When someone like that pleads guilty, it tells you what kind of state you are dealing with. Now zoom out to Putin's side of the table. There's no hard evidence that Russia was involved with the drug dealings of Maduro's government, but it's still a possibility. In 2018, 389 kilograms of cocaine were found at the Russian embassy in Buenos Aires. The investigation began 2 years earlier when the Russian ambassador alerted Argentine authorities that traffickers were trying to move 16 bags of cocaine out via a diplomatic flight. That might not be the only case when narco traffickers used Russian diplomatic channels as a shield. And even if Moscow was uninvolved with this particular trade, it will still bear the cost. When your partner is accused of running a narco state, the whole ecosystem around them becomes high risk, and that affects Russia's shadow fleet. Oil smuggling needs ships, brokers, false paperwork, payments that don't touch normal banks, and officials willing to look away. Drug trafficking needs the same style of services: transport, laundering, protection, ports, and silence. You don't need one grand conspiracy for the overlap to be real. You just need the same corrupt airstrip, the same friendly custom officer, the same accountant who knows how to make money disappear. That overlap is what made Venezuela useful to a sanctioned Kremlin. But it also turns the partnership into poison, because once Washington treats the regime as a criminal enterprise, every Russian deal starts to look like complicity, even if it's only oil and weapons. What Putin lost. Putin wanted Venezuela to be a controlled asset. Instead, in early January 2026, events showed the core weakness of that whole strategy. Russia didn't control the board. Someone else did. On January 4, US forces captured Nicolas Maduro and his wife and took them to the United States to face drug charges. The legality of that operation was immediately challenged at the United Nations, with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warning it set a dangerous precedent, and legal experts pointing to the lack of UN authorization, Venezuelan consent, or a clear self-defense basis. And Russia's reaction was revealing in its own way. Moscow officials described the US actions as unlawful and destabilizing. Dmitry Medvedev called it illegal, but also internally consistent with US interests, especially oil interests in what he literally called America's backyard. That line matters. It's Moscow admitting what this always was, a fight over influence and resources. Now, look at what happens to the asset when the political head is yanked off. The Venezuelan state company began cutting crude production because storage was limited and exports were halted by a US oil embargo. It also asked some joint ventures with foreign partners to curb output. Over 17 million barrels are already waiting offshore as there's no way to sell them. The company also faces a shortage of diluents needed to process heavy crude, even without bombs hitting refineries. The system was already wobbling like a tired machine. So what did Putin lose in Venezuela? He lost the only thing he really pays for abroad: control. He tried to turn a desperate state into a tool, a place to sell weapons and ongoing military aid to, move oil and money around sanctions, and poke the United States in its own neighborhood. But a tool that depends on one fragile regime is a bad tool. Once the partner's system breaks, every advantage flips. Oil becomes stranded risk. Weapons become political baggage. Shadow logistics become a map for seizures. Putin's broader pattern is clear. He keeps betting that other people's chaos can be turned into his leverage. Sometimes it works for a while. Then the bill shows up, like it did in Venezuela. Here's my question to you. What do you think Venezuela's future looks like after decades of misery inflicted by dictators? If you want more videos like this, subscribe and stick with me. And if you'd like to keep this channel independent, you can join the think tank or support via PayPal or Super Thanks. Plus, the hype button helps push the video to new viewers if you are watching on your mobile device. See you next time, and I'll be reading your comments.